I worked in the Trump administration.
Never in a million years did I ever think that I'd be working in the White House with a president that didn't care about the American people.
He would suggest not giving disaster relief to states that hadn't voted for him.
I remember one time after a wildfire in California, he wouldn't send relief because it was a Democratic state. So we went as far as looking up how many votes he got in those impacted areas to show him these are people who voted for you. This isn't normal. The job of the president is to protect Americans, regardless of politics.
If Trump's elected again, there'll be no one to stop his worst instincts. You'll have yes men help him implement Project 2025's agenda. Unchecked power, no guardrails.
They will be serving one man. I am voting for Kamala Harris because she will put the safety and security of every American first, whether they voted for her or not.
I'm Kamala Harris, and I approve this message.
Vaughn, it's a hard thing as a journalist to cover his indifference to human suffering and the need of his staffers to show him that some of the people suffering are his supporters. That step has to be taken is so extraordinary, and it's almost beyond a political or a policy tick. It's a psychological impediment to leading if you're indifferent to people that are victims of the wildfires.
Right.
Tell me what this picture looks like, sort of fleshed out with 8 or 9 years of reporting.
Exactly. 8 or 9 years of reporting. Let's be very clear. What makes this moment in time different than 2017, 2018, 2019 is that we have a body of evidence of who Donald Trump is. And time and again, when he was in the White House, again, the difference between that time and this time is when he was in the White House, he ran a propaganda campaign. If you talked about wildfires in 2018, 2019, 2020, he said that he was going to make the people of California, the state of California, pay because they hadn't done their part to groom the forest, not to mention the fact that most of that was federal land where those wildfires were taking place. But then I remember being in Phoenix in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. Donald Trump flew into town for a campaign rally, an indoor rally, on the day that they had just announced the highest single-day death total, the highest single-day case total. And what did Donald Trump do? He tried to dispute the actual deaths in Arizona. He tried to dispute the statistics and the numbers because it worked against him in his political campaign. You look at Puerto Rico. When 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017, what did Donald Trump do? He tweeted, 3,000 people did not die in the 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. He said this was done by Democrats in order to make me look as bad as possible. 3,000 people died in Puerto Rico, and Donald Trump tried to tell the American people it's not as bad. What's different now is he's not in office here. And let's be very clear about this, too, here. I've covered a great number of storms over the years, and I don't envy any of our teammates that are down in North Carolina, that are down in Florida right now. People are desperate. And what we are watching is somebody use his political position as the nominee for president to exploit people that are hungry, don't have working restrooms. These are folks that have lost all of their belongings. Some of them have lost their loved ones. And that is what our team on the ground is currently covering. There's more than 3,300 current National Guard and active military that are down in North Carolina alone. There are people that are in need. And when we see what Elon Musk, in the form of his tweets over the last several days, suggesting that FEMA is not doing their part, that the Biden-Harris administration are letting the people down, that they're being stranded, Donald Trump reveals what his motive here is. Just this morning saying, quote, I can't imagine anybody living in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, or Tennessee voting for her, saying that they have been stranded by her. This is a moment where people are vulnerable, and Donald Trump is using, without offering any specifics, he's not pointing to a certain town that is being ignored. He is not pointing to a certain story about somebody being ignored. He is painting a broad brushstroke of people that are going through very difficult times. And I think, again, I come back to my very first point is we have a body of evidence now of how Donald Trump tries to use this. And there was a difference from the time that he was in the White House when it was to deny reality versus now when it's to deny reality, but in a little different way, but to exploit it.
He lost in 2020. Are they sure this is a political winner for him?
It's a good question. There are people that we know that he wants to galvanize to come out and vote. people that he needs to come out and vote for him, those Trump supporters that he needs to turn into Trump voters here. And I don't know what it does for the middle part of the country that maybe voted for him in 2016, Joe Biden in 2020. I don't think that we have the reporting to really know the answer to that question. But Donald Trump, by this, without going into his mind, I think that this is a pure suggestion that he is trying to tell the North Carolina voters that are currently going through chaos and crisis that they need to show up in 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now to vote and make sure that they are voters, because there's a lot of people that don't vote. He needs his supporters to go out there and vote, and it's going and directly aiming at those folks to play off of this.
Nicole, first thing, clip that first part of what he just said, just laid out that arc of analysis of how Trump's behavior is now categorized for us. We can see it now and understand it better because of what happened while he was in office. That's one. Two, Vaughn put his finger on a very interesting aspect of what's happening in this campaign, which is why I am probably more bullish than some of my peers and friends who are a little bit more bearish. And that is the fact that you have voters out there who have moved off of Trump. No one really wants to delve into what that looks like. You've seen some analysis of it. There's polling out today, for example, that shows that weakening. Donald Trump saw this in his private polling about a month ago. How do we know that? Because what did he do? He went out and he told his voters how he needed them to behave. 2 months before that, what did he tell them? I don't need y'all to vote. We got this, right? We good. We don't need you to go out and do all that extra stuff. The RNC is sitting there frozen in place. There's no ground game to be operationalized against what's coming from the Democrats. And there are two campaigns underway right now. One is the one that LaCivita and Wiles wants to run, and it's the one that Donald Trump is running. Mm-hmm. And the one that is being run by Donald Trump is running into the very roadblock that Vaughn just put up. He's seeping voters. And what Kamala's trying to do is sop them up.
And what I would say is they're mutually exclusive paths, yep. Right? His plan is re-winning the people that didn't leave after January 6th.
Right.
A smart campaign, and I'm not saying anything else about LaCivita, but a strategic campaign, let me not call it smart because it's cynical as you know what, but a strategic campaign would be viewing those people as, you know, in your column, and you'd be getting, Trump's incapable of doing that. And I mean, the other thing I would add is that the Trump version has Elon Musk cheering, literally, like he binge cheer and cheering behind him, which is not any strategist's idea of a winning closing argument.
Real fast about North Carolina. That's the one battleground state that Donald Trump won in 2016 and 2020. And if he loses this election, we're going to be hearing about North Carolina if, in fact, he loses North Carolina. The reason Michael Whatley is the new chair of the RNC is because Donald Trump was convinced that Michael Whatley was the only chair in the country that was able to stop the steal in his state. That is why he's now the national chair. That's why he's made more than 7 stops over just the last 2 months in the state. If he doesn't win North Carolina, look at this hurricane being re-politicized by Donald Trump.
And I guess then the last point is to go back to your point about what happened a month ago. A month ago, the polls started to move in North Carolina. Yep. So good. Thank you so much for bringing. I knew you'd bring the receipts, and they're all over my table. Thank you very much. Thank you for your report.